So yeah, we've been running that one all morning with County Line semi-chisel safety chain. And this would be the counterpart from the 90s. This was a 262, designed from the 80s into the 90s. Not out of gas. I don't want to run it lean. So I don't know what to say about this little guy. What this basically is what would be normally considered a Husqvarna 560 or John Thread 2260, and that's what I did was I built from a 555 chassis and I put in the crank and top end and ignition and all that stuff from a 562, but I had to buy a crank for a 560 because it's unique. The difference is on the small mount saws, the stub end of the crank is shorter, and the only crank Husky made with stuffers for the small mount was for the 2260 John Thread and the 560 Husqvarna, which was sold overseas. So I had to order a 2260 crank, brand new. That's what's in there, stuffers and all. And then it has a 562 top end, an EL48 carb, and I can't remember the rest. Oh, I did a pop-up. Basically, I had an experimental piston that didn't work out, was a little bit scored, so I chucked it up in the lathe and turned a pop-up in it and then dropped this cylinder 20 thousandths to take advantage of it. And the net is it has more compression. That's the good news. Bad news is it's hard for me to start this thing anymore. The other thing I did was open up the cover on this side to get a little more airflow. You put your hand on this cover, you can tell and where it needs an opening because it'll be cool, whereas where there's no opening, it'll be hot, and that's where it's blowing the hot air. It's cool right here. It's not getting enough air back there, so I got to get more here. But anyway, and bar and chain, county line with a round tooth semi chisel, and it's pretty dull, but the thing has so much horsepower it doesn't care. So that's what we've been running today so far, and it's a semi chisel safety chain, and it basically stinks. I'd like to swap the bars, but this is a 3/8 setup on this 262, and the 262 is the counterpart in terms of the product line for Husqvarna from the 90s. This would be 562. In this case, it's a 560 small mount, and this is a 262, which is also, that small mount. So in reality, they're pretty similar, even though this one is mistagged because I put all the 562 goodies on a 550 bottom end. And like I said before, it's got a crank from a 560 or a 2260 John Thread, because on the small mount cases, the stub side, clutch side is shorter. Now, the other reason I can't swap around or get a good chain is you see where it says M78? That's because that takes a 78 link chain, even though it's a 20-inch bar, and all my 20-inch chains are 80s, so I can't even put a good chain on it. So it's handicapped, right? So let's see how a handicapped modern saw with auto tune and a purge compares to a 1990s top of the line professional level saw on some small wood over here. Right here. Get them fired up, and we'll run a couple of cookies and recognize that it's not so much about the saw in this case, it's probably about the chain. This one's clearly got more RPMs. I could lean the 260 out a little more, maybe I'll do that. It's getting to be warm today. But this is a junk chain. If I had a good chain on this, it would be pretty impressive. And I've been noodling with it all morning. That's about what we're going to get out of it. I'll come back and hit that same piece with the other saw so the wood change won't show so much. So what do you get with the modern version of this 562 versus the 262? The first thing you get with that is auto tune, so you don't have to ever mess with one of these. Second thing you get is the top cover comes off with those 3 snaps, so changing things like air filters is a little easier. The third thing you get is chain adjuster is on the side cover. You got captured nuts, a way more sophisticated anti-vibe system, a much more positive chain brake arrangement, and supposedly more fuel efficiency, and that's to be determined, I guess. This right here is one of the big advantages. A lot of guys argue about it, but especially when a saw has been sitting, having that little thing right there to purge the carburetor with fresh fuel, get the water out, makes a big difference. Now, as compared, you don't have a primer. You do have a multi-function high idle choke. Husky did that pretty early on, but so did Steel. And chain adjuster is down there somewhere. Just a little bit of a pain in the neck. Not supported, chain brake paddle. And it's got a pretty rudimentary anti-vibe system. So in this particular case, there is a fairly substantial change between 1990 and that's there, I think, about a 2015 or 16 build. I think I did that in 2016, maybe. So, 9-10 years ago. Then the Mark IIs are, they're evolutions on that, but I happen to think those are just fine. X torque to me is about emissions. It doesn't really help you. The old cylinders didn't need it. These cylinders are laid back a little bit as compared to vertical, and that gives you more area for exhaust, which gives you the ability to tune the exhaust a little bit better, and they took advantage of that. Ergonomics, yeah, it's a little bit different. Does it matter? I don't know. Each his own. But there's one big limitation that both of these saws have for me. And because they're a small mount, it's hard to get a bar longer than, 20 to 24 inches. And what I find is on the small mount, the 24s tend to toss their chains easier than, say, on the large mount systems. And I don't know, partly it's just because of how the chain spans from the tail of the bar to the sprocket, stuff like that. But how you like that for a comparison? Weight-wise, they're about the same. That one was tough to start this morning, but I hadn't run it literally probably in almost a year. But now it starts easy. This guy here was an easy thing to start. Of course, I had to tweak it with a screwdriver to match the warming day. So anyway, there you go. There's a comparison. Bye.